all those things. And which you say the relevancy and the context of each of these has an importance and a context of its own. It may not be in the context of a scenario you wish to spin on this, but each one of these have a context of their own. That's what's being emphasized. And usually a judge, in this case, is not going to be very unbiased. Neither is a jury. And the judge is going to say sustained to everything he's objecting to, because they don't want these truths coming out. It's like the O.J. case. It seems like that the jury of the O.J. case were a jury not of his peers, but a jury of his fans. And in the case of putting God on trial, the jury is pretty much going to be consisting of a jury of his fans. Let's look at the characteristics, the deeds, and the actual things this character called the biblical God did, according to his own diary, the Bible, and God's Word, chapter and verse. If you don't like these chapters and verses, you can't say you like the Bible, because these are biblical chapter and verses. They're the things that God supposedly did, this God did, according to his own diary again. So when the judge sustains something like this, the prosecutor might say, Your Honor, I'm trying to establish the character and attitude of this evil God that easily supports his murderous behavior. The judge says, if the prosecution talks back to me again, you'll be in contempt of court. The prosecutor really has his hands full with any jury or any believers or any people concerning this particular topic. Numbers 11:1. The people complained, so God murdered many of them just for complaining. This is when they're in the desert, by the way. Prosecutor, I charge that this God murders people just for complaining. Numbers 11:18, 20. God made them eat meat until it came out of their noses. As a result, they died. Numbers 14:2, 23. Chapters 2, verse 2 to verse 23. God said to Moses, How long will this nation continue to provoke me? I will murder them. I will kill them. I will kill all the people who saw what I did in Egypt and in the desert, but who still don't obey. Obedience is the whole thing concerning this agenda. Numbers 14:26, 30 to 38. God spoke to Moses and Aaron, You will not get to the promised land. Everyone over 20 years old who was counted is going to die in the desert. These were the people who were brought out of Egypt. The only exception will be Caleb and Joshua. Your corpses will fall in the desert. They will die. Remember, murder takes place when one takes another's life to fulfill one's personal agenda. There were 650,550, if I recall, men 20 years and older that could carry a sword, and that was what the census was coming out of Egypt. So the Torah in this note said that probably about 3 million people came out of Egypt, counting the older men, the younger boys and girls, and the women. So out of 3 million people, Joshua and Caleb were the only two to make it. And Moses didn't make the promised land, Aaron didn't make it, none of them made it either. So all those promises didn't take place. What happened was that God took them to this promised land, and then they looked down there and they see people living in the houses or whatever, and God says, okay, go down there and kill every man, woman, and child, or I'll do to you what I thought to do to them. The Hebrews didn't. They let some people go. God got really mad about that, and as a result, for the next 38 to 40 years, depending on which version you want to go with, he marched them in the desert until they all died. So he, in essence, killed them, did not give them the promised land. The next generation is what Joshua and the rest of them started taking and killing all the men, women, and children, and so forth to take the promised land. Numbers 14, chapter 14, 36, 38. Men who explored and gave a bad report about the promised land were murdered immediately. Only Joshua and Caleb remained alive. Sirach, part of the Apocrypha. Chapter 46, verses 7, 8. Caleb and Joshua were the only two spared out of the 600,000 infantry. Actually, it was 650,550. Oh, 603,000, excuse me, out of 550. Soldiers that left Egypt, only Caleb and Jesus get into the promised land. Yes, only after they steal, murder, torture, mutilate, and slaughter the current inhabitant owners and their babies for the land. Numbers 15, chapter 15, verses 32, 36. He found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. God commanded Moses to murder the man. Prosecutor, Would any jury member want to be God's lieutenant on this one? And the defense says objection, and the judge said sustained. Numbers 16, verses 1 through 35. Korah and 250 Israelite leaders stood up to Moses. Dathan and Abiram disobeyed Moses. God opened up the ground and sent Dathan, Abiram, their wives, sons, and babies down to the netherworld. God then burned alive by fire Korah's 250 men who had made an offering to God. Numbers chapter 17, verses 6 through 14. Then the whole Israelite community complained against Moses and Aaron. God appeared and said to Moses, "Depart that I may consume/murder them all at once." God murdered 14,700 more of his own. The 14,700 deaths are in the Catholic version only. There is no verse 14 in the King James version. The King James stops at verse 13. So that number of 14,700 appears only in the Catholic version. Numbers 18, verses 7 and 22. God ordered any layman coming near the altar will deserve death or murder. Again, he didn't want the average everyday person coming into his sanctuary or the handicapped. Numbers 21, 5, 6. The people spoke out against God and Moses. God sent poisonous snakes against his people, and they were bitten and they died. Prosecutor states, a point of hypocrisy, Your Honor. The biblical God murdered people for worshiping idols and honoring graven images. Yet God ordered a graven image by having Moses make a pole with a snake wrapped around it, so everyone who would see it would be saved from snake bite, as stated in Numbers 21, 8, 9. If the snake on the pole isn't a graven image, what is it? Today the thing is called a caduceus. It's a medical symbol. Amos 9:3. God said, "Though they hide from my sight at the bottom of the sea, I command the serpent, and he shall bite them." God uses snakes to do his murdering for him also. Numbers 21, 23, and 35. Sihon would not let Israel pass over his border, so God told Moses to murder him, his sons, and all his people, and the Israelites stole and possessed his land. Excuse me. Numbers chapter 21, verses 33-35. God ordered Moses to do to King of Og what he had done to others. Moses struck down his sons and all his people until none were left, and took possession of his land. Numbers 22, verses 33-35. God said, "Had your ass not turned away, I would have murdered you, but I would have spared your ass." Ass meaning donkey. Numbers chapter 25, 3-5. God's anger flared against Israel. God said to Moses, "Gather all the leaders, hold a public execution of the guilty before God, so that God's blazing wrath be turned away from Israel." Moses ordered the Israelite judges, "Murder those of your men who have submitted to the rites of Baal." So if you got any feelings about any god other than this biblical God, you're good as dead. Numbers 25, verses 6-9. Phineas, the King James Version. Pinchas, P-I-N-C-H-A-S, the Torah version. A grandson of Aaron, the priest, Moses' brother, taking a lance in hand, drove the lance through both the man and the woman's groin, murdering them both. That pleased God, so God stopped his murdering after God had murdered 24,000 more of his own chosen. What had happened is that an Israelite man had picked a non-Israelite lady to marry her against the wishes of Moses and his bunch. And when they were consummating the marriage in the anteroom, apparently having sex is consummating marriage in those days and under the law today, Phineas went in there with a lance, and while they were coupled, he ran them both through and killed them both.